Welcome to our Technology Readiness Updates webinar. Today we're going to be discussing login pools and how they affect your organization. Andrea Holmes, Senior Program Manager in our Technology Readiness Group, will be discussing this. Thank you, and here's Andrea.
Okay, so let's start here. So as a reminder, these upcoming infrastructure changes are happening for all of our sandbox instances on November 2nd and all of our production instances on December 7th. So what are these changes? We are adding additional login pools, and these login pools you can think of as conveyor belts. You're waiting at a security line at the airport, and you put your belongings in the conveyor belt. You can think of the conveyor belt as you're typing in your security credentials or your username and password to our Salesforce application. You then are presented to a security guard who validates you and makes sure that you're able to continue forward. Just like the security guard is validating you, our login pools validate you to ensure that you're able to move forward. So currently we have login pools in our West Coast and East Coast data center. What we're doing is we're adding 2 additional login pools to our Midwest and East Coast data center. Why are we doing this? Think about any time you're waiting in a line, whether it's at the security line at an airport or at the grocery store. Anytime that they open up another line, that means faster processing for everybody. You're going to be checked in or checked out even quicker. So for us to add these additional login pools, that just means improved performance for you. So what can you do? When would this happen to you? When would your end users see the Salesforce error page? If you have network restrictions, that means if you are restricting access to all of our Salesforce data centers and you're only allowing your customers, your end users or your inbound traffic integrations to talk to a specific instance or data center, and you have end users or integrations that point to login.salesforce.com, you will see that Salesforce error message. So again, if you have network restrictions set up and you have end users or integrations that point to login.salesforce.com, you're going to be affected. So you want to take action. What do? If you're in that half of the poll that we took this earlier today, that said that you're not in IT, you want to go ahead and talk to your IT department or your network administrator today. These changes are coming up quickly, and we've been communicating for a couple months, and we really want to make sure that you have set up the correct settings to make sure that you can move forward. If they ask, what do I need to do? Or maybe on the network administrator side, if you're more familiar with this, you want to make sure that you update your IP addresses, your proxy settings, or any other ways that you might have restricted network access. And we'll go into those technical details and more details in just a couple more minutes. So what does this mean? Again, imagine this conveyor belt, and you're being processed, and you're trying to go through the security line, and here's the security guard. If you have network restrictions set up where you're not letting your end users talk to these other new data centers, these other new security lines that you've opened up, it's like there's no security guard there to process them, to validate them, to let them come through. So again, we want to remind you to talk to your IT department today to ensure your network settings are set up to allow access to all our Salesforce data centers. We have 2 different knowledge articles available to help you. If you hop onto our success.salesforce.com website, you can simply search for login pools, and you will come up with the first knowledge article. And if you type in IT ranges, you'll come up with the second knowledge article. So really easy to find. Both of these articles were also included in our most recent communication and our first communication that was sent out back in September as well. So you should have links to both of those. If not, you can also hop over to our community group, the Success Release Readiness Community Group. At that note, let's go ahead and move over to our questions. So Kathy, I'm actually going to pull them up on here as well. Perfect. Okay, so question number 1, and Matt, I'm going to go ahead and field this to you. How do we figure out if we have network restrictions?
That's going to be something that your IT department has put in place. So it's going to be, them blocking access on your network using a firewall or a router or some sort of, proxy server to restrict where the users at your office can go to on the internet. So we're not talking about IP restrictions inside the Salesforce application. We're talking about these are, your corporate network restrictions.
Absolutely. So just to reiterate what Matt said right there, this is not any network settings that you have inside the Salesforce application. This is all something that you or your network administrator might have done on the back end. So you really need to have those conversations. Another way to figure out if you have access to all of our data centers, what we're going to be doing is adding an additional FAQ to that knowledge article I just mentioned, and we're going to provide different instances for you to do a test on. So what's really interesting, and it's a little hard to find, might be interesting, but if I go to ne5.salesforce.com and I type in Kathy O'Connell at Salesforce, no, that's fine actually, Kathy, we can leave that. So what's interesting is this username and password is associated with Kathy's account on our NA1 instance. So even though the URL up here points to NA5, because our network has allowed access to all of them, our login pools are going to, maybe they, Matt, I assume we don't have access to all of them, and that's why this isn't working?
I can retype in the password.
Or maybe the password is incorrect. Anyways, what the end situation should be is if you have access to all of our Salesforce data centers, you should be able to log in from any instance. There we go.
Yeah.
So even though that instance pointed to na5.salesforce.com, and this is Kathy's NA1 instance, she was able to log in because our login pools are able to redirect. So what we'll do is in that knowledge article, we'll be able to provide different instances that you can do that test on yourself to make sure that your end users can talk to any of our data centers. If the second question is, if I have access to Salesforce from home and I know I did not block the data centers in my home router, then I should be fine? Yes. Assuming your company did not put restrictions in place, whenever you're connected to VPN, your own company's virtual private network, you will be good to go.
If I restrict login IP ranges by using the session settings, do these new changes apply to me?
Matt, can you answer that most recent question about session settings?
Right. Yeah, if you're using the IP restrictions inside the Salesforce application to restrict where your users can log on from, you do not need to make any changes. This is only going to affect people that are putting those restrictions on their actual corporate network. If you're just restricting inside the application, then everything will happen seamlessly and there's no changes that you need to make.
The next question, Matt, if they test in dev and everything is good to go, production should be good as well?
Correct. Yeah, the change we're going to be making later this month, or sorry, at the beginning of next month, at the beginning of November, for test.salesforce.com, which is for sandbox logins. If that works fine for you, then the exact same change will be made later on for the normal production instances, and so you should see no problems at that time.
Great. Okay. Looks like maybe one more question. Oh.
No,
okay, great. So we are going to go back to our presentation. So these next couple of slides are definitely going to be technical in nature. So the half of you that said you're not technical people, you're not in IT, you can go ahead and hop off the call if you'd like. Otherwise, feel free to stay on and learn some more about network restrictions. So to start off, how are your firewalls set up? If you limit your firewalls by IP address of the instance, let's say na5.salesforce.com, and your end users or integrations point to na5.salesforce.com, you're not going to have any issues. But if you limit by IP address of that na5 instance and you have end users or integrations that point to login.salesforce.com, then you will experience issues. You do need to update your network settings. And again, if you limit by IP address of the production and DR data center, so the data centers, but your end users and integrations point to instance.salesforce.com, you're still okay. It's just if they're pointing to login.salesforce.com. Because again, if they're going through that different security line and there's nobody there to process them, there's no security guard there, they're never going to make it in. And then, of course, if you include all of our Salesforce IP addresses and you do follow our best practices, you're not going to have any issues. So the same thing with proxy settings. If you restrict by instance, you're not going to have any issues if your end users and integrations point to that instance. But if they point to login.salesforce.com, you do need to make those changes for your proxy settings. But if you open up your proxy settings, they're either entirely open or you only restrict by star.salesforce.com, meaning you allow any prefix.salesforce.com, your end users and integrations can point to either that instance or login.salesforce.com, and they won't experience any issues. So we're going to go over some use cases and have one little quiz. So to talk about firewalls, let's say you as a customer, you're on NA5, which is in our West Coast data center. Your end users and integrations point to login.salesforce.com. Login pools are added, and now you're redirected to our Midwest data center. Your firewall limits IP range to only the West Coast data center. So you would not be able to log in. Your end users and integrations would not work, as you would be restricting access by data center and unable to access our Midwest data center. You just wouldn't be allowed to go in that security line. There would be no security guard there to process you. So what you would do, our best practice, is that your firewall allows access to all of our Salesforce IP ranges. And that means your end users and your integrations would work, and as you would not be restricting access by data center. So a quick quiz on our proxy settings to see how your understanding is. Again, same scenario, customers on NA5, which is in our West Coast data center. End users and integrations point to login.salesforce.com. Login pools are added, and now your end users and integrations are redirected to the Midwest data center. And you have proxy settings that restrict access to only the West Coast data center. What would happen? I'm going to go ahead and post this poll. Got some votes coming in. You guys are doing great. 100% correct so far. Got 30% voted. The numbers are continuing to go up, so I'm going to give you guys about 20 more seconds. About 44% of the people voted. Numbers are still going up. It's going to give people a little more time. 48% voted, 50% voted. I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. All right, so 88% of you were correct. The customer would have issues logging in. So let me go ahead and show my screen again. Hopefully all of you can see that. So end users would not be able to log in, integrations would not work, as they would be restricting access by data center and unable to access the Midwest data center. So what they can do is they open up their proxy settings to only restrict access to star.salesforce.com. And that way they would not be restricting access by data center unless able to access our Midwest data center. I'm sure that some customers have very tight IT security restrictions, so let's go ahead and cover that. These are not our best practices whatsoever, and we highly recommend that you do not do this. But if you do have tight IP security restrictions, we will discuss what you can do to ensure that your end users and integrations will still be able to access their Salesforce application after this maintenance. Please note that any upcoming splits or migrations or any one-off org migrations that you might choose to do, you would still have to update your IP restrictions to include the new instance or data center IP ranges. And any exception requests based on limited time to update your tight IP restrictions would be denied. So if you don't want to follow our Salesforce best practices, you might have gained this from the previous slides, but you can point your end users to log in directly to your instance. So ne5.salesforce.com, for example, and point your integrations to also point to that instance. And then you can set up your firewalls or proxy servers to limit IP ranges to only that instance or data center your instance is on. The key thing that we want you to do, though, is if you're going to restrict by that data center, at least add those network ranges for our disaster recovery data center. And that way, if we need to fail you over to that DR instance during an extended service disruption, you're ready to go. Something to note, of course, features may break, and this is because within a data center, we have different features that are shared within our app servers. And so many different instances use these features. Spellcheck, LiveAgent, Salesforce Files are just some features that may not work if you do restrict by instance. So a final review, and then we'll go back to Q&A. Who is impacted? All customers on all instances globally. What is happening? We're adding additional login pools to our Midwest and East Coast data centers. When is this happening? All sandboxes will be updated on November 2nd, and all of our production instances will be updated on December 7th. What do you need to do? If you have end users or integrations that point to login.salesforce.com, you need to update your network settings to ensure access to all of our Salesforce data centers. And if you don't take that action, if you have end users or integrations that point to login.salesforce.com and you have network restrictions to certain Salesforce data centers, then your end users may experience issues logging in or the integrations may fail post-go live. So let's go ahead and hop back over to our FAQ. All right, so where can I get a copy of these slides or recording? All of these slides will be posted in our community group, the Success Release Readiness community group, by Thursday, the slides and this recording. All right, this may be self-evident, but if login.salesforce.com shows up when we go to the login page, should we assume that this is one of the two items that is necessary to be affected by login pools? Yes. If you're showing that URL is login.salesforce.com, whenever you're up here, then that's it. If you go strictly to www.salesforce.com, that's not going to work. And then you click on login, wherever it is. Anyways, you get my point. It will take you to our login.salesforce.com, and that means that you are going through our login pools and you will be processed by your login pools, any of our login pools in any of our data centers. So you do need to make sure that you have updated network security settings. Can you provide the new IP addresses? The IP addresses are not new, to be clear, but IP addresses across all of our data centers can be found in our knowledge article. I actually am not allowed to show those on screen right now, but if you hop into our knowledge article, you will be able to see them. That's under the Network IP Ranges knowledge article. We have Salesforce links on our website that point to documents stored on salesforce.com. These are accessed globally. What are the anticipated issues with this change? There should be no issues with that change. Again, this is whenever you're accessing login.salesforce.com. So, Matt, I mean, do you have any other comment? I don't think there's going to be any issue.
Yeah, I mean, as long as these are links directly to files that are part of your org, I don't think there's going to be any issue. So if it's something that you click on and then you get redirected to a login page before you can view the document, you probably want to make sure that that login page isn't login.salesforce.com. If it is, then there will be an impact, but otherwise, if it's just a link that you click on and you go directly to that document, then there's no impact.
And please let us know if that answered your question. Next question, is there any impact on web to lead from integrations? Matt?
No, there should be no impact to web to lead. Yeah, this is
Yeah.
only for normal users that are logging into the Salesforce application.
So that means no impact to any email to case, web to X,
Right,
anything.
exactly.
Great. Would we be impacted if login is via single sign-on?
Yeah, if your users are going to login.salesforce.com initially before they're redirected to your single sign-on page, then they would be impacted. If they're going to the instance or you have a My Domains set up where you're going to a custom URL for the login, then you will not be impacted.
So again, let's say you are, let's do login.salesforce.com. So if you're at login.salesforce.com, you will be sent to our login pool. I'm sure that has made that clear. Let's say you're at abc123.my.salesforce.com. If that's your My Domains name, you're actually going to skip our login polls, so you don't need to make any changes. Hopefully that provided more clarity. Are there any other questions coming in?
It came in while we were talking.
Can you repeat the network IP addresses? We are not posting the network IP addresses. However, if you hop over to our knowledge article in our success.salesforce.com website, you will be able to find them. The first one that you can easily search for, login pools, and within that login pools knowledge article, now that I've said login pools 100 times, I'm sure you won't forget that. You'll be able to find this how to prepare for additional login pools. And inside here, there's actually the link to the current list of all of our Salesforce IP ranges right inside. Matt, I'm going to go ahead and let you take that next question. Is there any impact on web service calls?
Yeah, any calls that you're making, if you're making them to login.salesforce.com and not making them directly to your instance, then there will be an impact if you have IP restrictions. And again, that's the thing we want to stress here. There's a two-step qualification process here, you know. So it's not just that you're using login. You have to be using login and have IP restrictions on your network. So if you're just using login and you have no IP restrictions, then you will not have any impact from this change. And then we have another question about the data loader, if it's pointing to login.salesforce.com, and that's the same thing. If it is pointed to login.salesforce.com, then and you do have IP restrictions, then the change will affect you. I think we have another question here about Informatica, if it's pointed at na12.salesforce.com. So right now that would mean that you're pointed directly at your instance, and so you're not using login, and so you wouldn't have any changes that you need to make as a result of this improvement that we're doing.
Okay, the next question, how do we test and ensure that traffic through all listed IP ranges are working fine? So again, what we're going to do is add different instances that are across our data centers to verify that you're able to log in. So if you go, for the example that we showed earlier, we were at na5.salesforce.com. Kathy typed in her NA1 credentials for her Salesforce to access her Salesforce application. And our login pools actually redirected her to the NA5 to the NA1 instance, the correct instance, even though she was directly at NA5. So that's a great way for you to be able to test that you're being processed correctly.
Yeah, and then we had another question here about somebody's using Salesforce.com as a database for their donations, and they don't have any other users. If you're using this to process, you know, people are going to somewhere on your website and submitting their information, and then that's being sent over to Salesforce. it will not affect that in any way. The only thing it's going to affect are actual Salesforce application users that you have that are logging into salesforce.com directly. So anything, feeding from a website, it will not affect.
Okay, any impact to Salesforce community URL or site URL?
No. Yeah, again, this is only for users that are actually logging into the application itself. And then we had a question about proxy settings. Yeah, so anytime you're doing, filtering a proxy server, if you're doing it by domain name, so if you're filtering based on, like star.salesforce.com or login.salesforce.com, everything should be fine. You may want to make sure after the change that, if you're doing things based on DNS name, that all your DNS servers have gotten the update after we've made the change, just to make sure things are okay on that front. But anything being done by domain name should be fine. It's mainly IP restrictions where you're restricting by IP address, where we want to make sure that you're using the latest ranges that are published in the knowledge base article.
Okay, the next question, how do we determine if we have IP restrictions? We did just cover that, so we recommend that you simply just talk to your IT department or your network administrator to ensure that you're allowing access to all of our data centers. And can that be determined within Salesforce? No, these changes have nothing to do with our Salesforce application. What we're doing is a favor to all of our customers and making sure that you followed our best practice and you're allowing access to all of our Salesforce data centers. And so there are no changes that you have to make within the Salesforce application. And then impact to email to case scenarios, we mentioned that earlier. No impact to email to case, web to case, web to X, email to anything. No impact there.
Andrea, we have a follow-up question from a previous question. The previous question was, for my company, we use Salesforce just as a database for our donations. We do not have any other users. Does it still affect me? I think there was clarification on the question. What I meant is that I am the only one logging into Salesforce and nobody else. I will process the donation records right into Salesforce. Excuse me for asking again, but it is not clear to me. Will I still be able to log in?
Yes, if you're the one and only person using Salesforce, that means you've never had a network administrator, meaning you have never set these restrictions up, so that's fantastic. You have nothing to worry about. And please let me know if that answered that question. Thank you for following up.
This one's back to the email the case. So I think it's the second part, notifications back from Salesforce.
So the integrations that we're referring to are inbound traffic integrations only. So those notifications that you're talking about are outbound notifications, so you have no concern. You should make sure that your email relay settings are including all IP addresses. And those email relay IP addresses are also in that network IP ranges document. Matt, did I answer that correctly?
Yeah. Yeah, anything outbound, where Salesforce is, either sending you an email back or calling back to a web application you may have on site, there's going to be no change to how that works from how it's working today.
Okay, Matt, this doesn't affect an API login call to SFDC if they use login.salesforce.com?
If your initial API login is going to login.salesforce.com, then yes, this would affect you if you have IP restrictions on your network. If you're sending all your API calls directly to the instance, then this will not affect you.
Again, please let us know if we're answering your questions, or mainly if we're not answering your questions, if you have any follow-up questions. So trusted IP ranges in Salesforce are relevant for this then. Yes.
Yeah, and I think what they're referring to there inside the application, right? So this doesn't, you don't have to change anything inside the application. Those IP addresses that you're putting there are actually, your company's IP addresses to restrict how your users can log on using the Salesforce application. We're only concerned here with if you've done those sorts of restrictions on your network in another way, you know, using a firewall or some sort of proxy server.
Would there be any impact on email alerts or notifications sent to user for lead assignment, appointment generation after this change? No, no impact to any web to X, email to anything. Anything coming from our Salesforce application and being sent out, there will be no impact. And it looks like that's the end of our questions. We're going to give 20 more seconds to see if more questions come in.
And if you can't type that fast, just say wait and type that and then.
Okay. It looks like that's it. So thanks everyone for joining. If you have additional questions, please reach out to your account team and they will find the answer for you. Thank you very much.